The base gate shimmered in the pre-dawn heat, security lights casting long shadows across the tarmac at Bagram Airfield. The guard's hand came up fast, palm out, blocking the path of a woman in civilian clothes carrying a weathered duffel bag. She wore jeans and a faded university sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Nothing about her suggested she belonged here. Not at this hour, not at this gate, not anywhere near the razor wire and hardened aircraft shelters that housed America's most classified special operations assets. "Ma'am, you need to turn around," the guard said, his voice carrying that particular edge of authority that comes from 6 months of gate duty and zero tolerance for confusion. "This is a restricted area. Civilian access is through the main terminal." She shifted the duffel to her other shoulder, her movements unhurried. "I have orders," she said simply, reaching into her jacket pocket. The guard stepped forward, one hand moving to his sidearm. "I said step back, now." What he didn't see was the leather ID wallet, the worn edges that spoke of a decade of checkpoints just like this one. What he didn't know was that the woman standing before him had logged more combat hours than his entire platoon combined, that her call sign was whispered in ready rooms from Kandahar to Ramstein, that the aircraft waiting 300 meters away on the classified flight line wouldn't move an inch without her in the cockpit. "Move aside," he said, his voice hardening. Then his hand was on her shoulder, firm, pushing. "I'm not asking again." She didn't resist, didn't pull rank, didn't raise her voice. She simply let herself be moved backward 2 steps, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something in that gaze, something that made him hesitate for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. Behind them, an engine sound cut through the morning air. Not the standard turbofan whine of a transport, but something different. Lower, more aggressive, the distinctive growl of a fighter being prepped for flight. The guard's radio crackled. "Tower to Gate 7, do we have eyes on Captain Reza Kahani? We have a scramble order, authentication code Crimson Actual, and we are 15 minutes from mission abort." The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening of her spine, a tightening of her jaw. The guard's hand was still on her shoulder when his brain finally processed the name that had just come through his earpiece. "Captain Reza Kahani, not Sarah, not Chin, Reza." The guard's face went pale. 5,000 miles away, in a basement operations center buried beneath the Pentagon, satellite imagery showed a convoy of trucks crossing the Pakistan border, their cargo bays covered with thermal-resistant tarps. Intelligence analysts had been tracking them for 72 hours, watching as they moved through mountain passes that shouldn't have been accessible to vehicles that size. The trucks were heading toward a compound that officially didn't exist, and the window to interdict them was closing fast. The mission required a pilot who could thread a needle at Mach .9, who could put ordnance on target in a valley so narrow that radar would be useless, who could make decisions in the space between heartbeats when lives hung in the balance. The mission required someone who had done it before, someone who understood that special operations wasn't about following rules, but about knowing which ones to break and when. The mission required Reza Kahani, and she was currently being detained at her own base gate by a 22-year-old with a clipboard and an attitude. The radio crackled again. "Gate 7, confirm status immediately." The guard's hand dropped from Reza's shoulder like he'd touched a live wire. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. Behind him, his partner was already raising the barrier, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. Reza adjusted her duffel bag, her movements still unhurried, still calm. "I have orders," she repeated, and this time she didn't reach for her ID. She didn't need to. The sound of jet engines spooling up said everything that needed saying. She walked past the guard without another word, her boots crunching on the gravel, her silhouette growing smaller against the vast expanse of the flight line. The guard watched her go, watched as she approached the aircraft that was waiting for her, watched as ground crews snapped to attention, watched as the crew chief saluted with a crispness that spoke of genuine respect, not obligation. He would tell this story later in the chow hall in the barracks, anywhere someone would listen. He would tell it with self-deprecating humor, turning his mistake into an anecdote. But he would never forget the look in her eyes, that moment when he realized he just tried to physically remove one of the most decorated combat pilots in theater from her own base. The F-16 waiting for Reza was not standard issue. Its tail number had been painted over, replaced with a temporary identifier that would be changed again after this mission. The ordnance loaded under its wings was not listed in any manifest. The flight plan filed with Tower was a fiction, a cover story that would place her 300 miles from where she would actually be operating. She dropped her duffel at the crew chief's feet and began her walk-around inspection, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over control surfaces, checking for hydraulic leaks, verifying weapons load. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Tors who'd worked with her on a dozen previous missions, stood back and let her work. "Tight window today, ma'am," Tors said. "They're all tight," Reza replied, her fingers running along a seam in the wing root. "That's why they call us." The Pentagon Operations Center had been tracking this convoy since it first appeared on satellite imagery 3 days prior. The trucks were carrying components for a weapons system that shouldn't exist, technology that had been stolen from a research facility in Germany 6 months ago. The intelligence community had been chasing leads across 4 continents, following a trail of dead drops and encrypted communications, always one step behind. Until now. The convoy's route took it through a mountain pass that would bring it within striking distance for exactly 17 minutes. Before that window, the terrain provided too much cover. After that window, the trucks would disappear into a tunnel complex that ran for miles underground, and they'd be lost. 17 minutes. Reza climbed the ladder to her cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with the familiarity of someone returning home. Her hands moved through the startup sequence without conscious thought, muscle memory built over thousands of hours. Generators online, hydraulics pressurized, inertial navigation system aligned. The radio in her helmet crackled to life. "Viper 1, this is Pegasus Control. You are cleared for immediate departure, runway 27. Authentication code Crimson Actual confirmed. Target package is being uploaded to your systems now." Reza's hands paused over the throttle. Crimson Actual, the highest priority designation in theater. This wasn't a standard interdiction. This was something else. "Pegasus Control, Viper 1 copies. Request target details." There was a pause, longer than it should have been. When the controller's voice came back, it carried an edge of tension that made Reza's pulse quicken. "Viper 1, target is a mobile convoy carrying nuclear triggering mechanisms. Previous attempts at interdiction have failed. Time on target is critical. You are authorized to use all necessary force." Nuclear triggering mechanisms. The words hung in the air of her cockpit like smoke. This wasn't about stolen technology or black market weapons. This was about preventing a catastrophic proliferation event, about stopping devices that could turn dirty bombs into city killers from reaching the people who would use them without hesitation. Reza advanced the throttle, feeling the F-16 strain against its wheel chocks like a hunting dog on a leash. "Viper 1 copies all, proceeding to target area." The tower cleared her for takeoff, and she released the brakes. The acceleration pressed her back into her seat as the runway lights blurred past. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick, feeling that perfect moment when the aircraft left the Earth, when gravity released its hold and flight took over. Banking east into the rising sun, Reza checked her tactical display. The target area was 200 nautical miles away, deep in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The convoy would reach the interdiction window in 43 minutes. She had trained for this her entire career. The daughter of an Iranian immigrant who'd fled the revolution, Reza had grown up hearing stories of what happens when extremism gets its hands on weapons of mass destruction. Her father had been an engineer in Tehran, had watched colleagues disappear in the night, had seen the country he loved transform into something he no longer recognized. He'd brought his family to America with nothing but their clothes and his determination that his daughter would grow up free. Reza had honored that sacrifice by becoming the thing he'd always dreamed she could be, a warrior who stood between the innocent and the darkness. But the path had not been easy. Flight school had been brutal, not because of the academics or the flying, but because of the doubts. The subtle questions about whether she had the physical strength for high-G maneuvers, the not-so-subtle comments about women in combat roles, the assumptions that she'd wash out, that she was taking a slot from someone more deserving, that this was all some diversity initiative rather than merit. She'd answered those doubts the only way that mattered, by being better. Better scores in academics, better performance in the simulator, better weapons delivery accuracy on the range. She'd made herself undeniable, and in doing so, she'd earned her call sign. Viper. Not because she was aggressive or showy, but because she struck with precision and purpose. Because when she committed to an attack run, the target didn't walk away. Because she was patient and calculated and absolutely lethal when the moment came. The mountains rose before her, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. Snow gleamed on the highest ridges, and the valleys below remained shrouded in shadow. This was some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, where downdrafts could slam an aircraft into a cliff face and where there was no such thing as a safe ejection. Reza descended to 500 feet above ground level, threading between peaks, using the terrain to mask her approach. Radar was worse than useless here. It would just paint the mountains and turn her display into a meaningless mess of returns. She flew by sight and instinct, reading the landscape, trusting her training. Viper 1, Pegasus Control. Target convoy has been spotted entering the interdiction zone. You have 14 minutes until they reach the tunnel entrance. 14 minutes. Reza advanced her throttle further, the F-16's engine responding with a surge of power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 knots, and the mountains became a blur of rock and ice. Her targeting pod came online, its infrared sensor painting the valley ahead in shades of green and black. There, on the narrow road that clung to the mountainside, a line of vehicles crawled forward. 5 trucks, military pattern, spaced at careful intervals. Pegasus Control, Viper 1 has eyes on target. Confirm authorization for engagement. Another pause. Then, Viper 1, you are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Minimize collateral damage. Reza selected her weapons. Joint direct attack munitions, GPS-guided bombs with the precision to thread through a window from 30,000 feet. But she wasn't at 30,000 feet. She was down in the weeds, and the standard employment envelope for these weapons didn't apply. She would have to improvise. The first truck was approaching a choke point, a section of road where a landslide had narrowed the passage to barely the width of a vehicle. If she could take out that truck there, it would block the entire convoy, trap them against the mountain with nowhere to run. Reza armed her weapons and rolled into her attack run. The valley walls rose on either side, so close she could see individual rocks, could see the ancient erosion patterns carved by centuries of wind and rain. The targeting symbology on her heads-up display aligned with the lead truck, and every instinct she had screamed at her to pickle off her weapon and get out of this death trap of a valley. But instinct wasn't enough, not here, not now. She held the run for 2 more seconds, waiting for the truck to reach exactly the right position, waiting for the geometry to be perfect. Her thumb hovered over the weapon release button, and time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Then the moment came. She pressed the button, felt the aircraft lurch slightly as 2,000 pounds of ordnance dropped from her wing. She pulled back hard on the stick, pulling 8GS as she climbed away from the valley floor, the mountains spinning in her canopy as she executed a combat break that would have made her instructors proud. Behind her, the bomb fell true. It struck the lead truck precisely as it entered the choke point, and the explosion tore through the vehicle with surgical precision. The road collapsed beneath the burning wreckage, sending truck and debris tumbling down the mountainside in a cascade of fire and twisted metal. The remaining 4 trucks braked hard, their drivers faced with an impossible situation. Forward was blocked. The road behind them was too narrow to turn around. They were trapped. Pegasus Control Viper 1. Lead vehicle destroyed. Remaining convoy is immobilized. Request instructions. The response came quickly. Viper 1, excellent work. Maintain station. Ground team is inbound to secure the cargo. Reza established a circular orbit above the valley, her eyes scanning for threats. These mountains were known Taliban territory, and it was entirely possible that the convoy had escorts she hadn't seen yet. Anti-aircraft weapons, maybe shoulder-fired missiles. In this terrain, at low altitude, she was vulnerable. Minutes passed. The trucks sat motionless on the road, their drivers probably scrambling to figure out what to do. Reza could see figures moving around the vehicles, could see them gesturing toward the burning wreckage blocking their path. Then her radar warning receiver lit up. Someone was painting her with targeting radar. Pegasus Control Viper 1. I'm spiked. Confirm no friendly air defense in area. Viper 1 negative. No friendly systems. Evade and identify threat. Reza didn't need to be told twice. She broke hard left, diving toward the valley floor, putting a mountain between herself and whatever was tracking her. The radar warning receiver went silent, the threat masked by terrain. She came around the mountain from a different angle, lower now, using every fold in the landscape to stay hidden. Her eyes scanned the ridgelines, looking for the telltale signature of an air defense system. There, on a plateau overlooking the valley, a mobile SAM launcher was traversing, its radar dish sweeping back and forth as it searched for her. This wasn't some crude, shoulder-fired weapon. This was a modern, sophisticated system, probably Chinese-made, definitely not something the Taliban should have possessed. The mission had just gotten significantly more complicated. Reza's mind raced through her options. She could engage the SAM site, but that would use up ordnance she might need for the convoy. She could call for support, but there was nothing in range that could get here in time. She could abort, but that meant letting nuclear triggering mechanisms disappear into a tunnel system where they'd never be recovered. None of those options were acceptable. She selected her remaining JDAMs and began calculating an attack solution. The SAM site was protected by terrain on 3 sides, making a conventional attack run suicidal. But there was a gap, a narrow approach corridor that would give her maybe 10 seconds of weapons employment time before she had to break off or become a fireball. 10 seconds, that's all she needed. Reza pushed the throttle to military power and dropped even lower, flying so close to the mountainside that her wingtip vortices kicked up dust and loose stones. The SAM site's radar swept past her position, but she was too low, too fast, masked by the terrain until the last possible second. Then she pulled up, popping over the ridgeline like a fighter emerging from behind cover. The SAM site filled her targeting display, and she had time to register the expressions of shock on the faces of the crew before her thumb mashed the weapon release button. The JDAM dropped away clean, and Reza was already rolling inverted, diving back toward the protection of the valley floor. Behind her, the bomb impacted precisely on target, and the SAM launcher disappeared in a bloom of orange flame and black smoke. Pegasus Control Viper 1, threat neutralized, convoy remains secured. Viper 1, outstanding performance. Ground team ETA is 7 minutes, maintain overwatch. Reza settled back into her orbit, but her fuel gauge was starting to demand attention. The aggressive maneuvering and low-altitude flight had burned through her reserves faster than planned. She had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time before she'd have to head back to base. The valley below was silent now, the burning wreckage of the SAM site sending a column of smoke into the morning sky. The convoy trucks sat motionless, their occupants probably terrified, probably armed, probably willing to die rather than let their cargo be captured. Razaz's radio crackled with a new voice. "Viper 1, this is Ghost Leader. We have eyes on your position. Excellent work on clearing the LZ." Ghost Leader, Special Forces, the people who would actually secure the convoy and retrieve the triggering mechanisms. Ghost Leader Viper 1. Be advised, convoy personnel may be heavily armed. Recommend extreme caution. Copy that, Viper 1. We're prepared for resistance. Maintain your position until we give the all-clear. Razaz watched as 4 helicopters materialized from behind a ridgeline, flying nap of the earth with the precision that only special operations aviators possessed. They flared into a hover near the convoy, and ropes dropped from their doors. Figures fast-roped down, moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of hundreds of training iterations. The takedown was textbook. Flashbangs to disorient, overwhelming force to prevent resistance, zip ties to secure prisoners. Within 90 seconds, the convoy personnel were face down on the ground, and Ghost team operators were searching the trucks. Viper 1, Ghost Leader. Cargo confirmed. We have the packages. This is a successful interdiction. Relief washed through Razaz's chest, a physical sensation that made her realize how tense she'd been. Nuclear triggering mechanism secured. Catastrophe averted. Mission accomplished. Ghost Leader Viper 1 copies. Good hunting down there. Viper 1, you made it possible. Ghost Leader sends his respects. You're cleared to return to base. Razaz turned her aircraft west, climbing out of the mountains toward the rising sun. Her fuel was low but sufficient, and the sky ahead was clear. She let herself relax slightly, let the adrenaline begin to fade, let the enormity of what had just happened settle into her consciousness. She had stopped a nuclear proliferation event. She had done it alone, in some of the most hostile terrain imaginable, against enemies who had nearly killed her. And she had done it while nursing a quiet anger at being manhandled by a gate guard who'd assumed she didn't belong. The irony wasn't lost on her. The flight back to Bagram took 35 minutes, and Razaz used the time to decompress, to run through the mental checklist that helped her transition from combat to peacetime. It was a skill she'd learned early, this ability to compartmentalize, to separate the person who could make life-and-death decisions in milliseconds from the person who would later walk through the chow hall and make small talk about the weather. Tower cleared her for landing, and she brought the F-16 down with a smoothness that belied her fatigue. As she taxied back to the flight line, she could see a crowd gathered near the operations building. Officers, enlisted personnel, even some contractors who had no business being on the flight line at all. Word had spread, somehow it always did. Razaz shut down her engines and popped the canopy. The morning air hit her face, hot and dry and smelling faintly of jet fuel and dust. She climbed down from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after hours in the ejection seat. The crowd parted as she approached, and Razaz saw a full colonel walking toward her, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his bearing suggesting he'd been in the military since before she was born. "Captain Kahani," he said, his voice carrying across the flight line. "That was exceptional work today." Razaz came to attention and saluted. "Thank you, sir." The colonel returned her salute, then extended his hand. "I'm Colonel Matthews, Special Operations Liaison. The Joint Task Force commander wanted me to convey his personal thanks. What you did today prevented a major catastrophe." They shook hands, and Razaz noticed that the crowd was still watching, still listening. She felt uncomfortable with the attention, preferred the anonymity of the cockpit to the visibility of the flight line. "I was just doing my job, sir," she said. "Your job," Matthews repeated, a slight smile crossing his face. "Captain, most pilots would have turned back when that SAM sight lit them up. You went through it. That's not job performance. That's something else entirely." Razad didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Matthews seemed to understand. He nodded once, then addressed the crowd. "This pilot," he said, his voice carrying authority, "just single-handedly prevented nuclear weapons technology from falling into the hands of extremists. She flew into terrain that would make most people soil themselves. She took out a modern air defense system while flying barely above the treetops. And she did it all with fuel running so low that she landed here with warning lights flashing in her cockpit." The crowd erupted in applause. Razaf felt her face flush, felt that familiar discomfort with praise that had followed her throughout her career. She'd never sought glory, never wanted to be the center of attention. She just wanted to do the work, to honor her father's sacrifice by being excellent at something that mattered. But as the applause continued, as she saw the expressions on the faces around her shift from curiosity to genuine respect, something inside her relaxed slightly. Maybe this was what earning it looked like. Not fighting for recognition, but having recognition given freely because the work spoke for itself. The gate guard was in the crowd. She spotted him near the back, his face a mix of embarrassment and awe. Their eyes met for a moment and Rizaz saw him mouth two words, "I'm sorry." She nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without making a show of it. He'd made a mistake, learned from it, and that was enough. She held no grudge, harbored no resentment. The mission mattered more than ego, and she'd never been the type to settle scores when there was work to be done. Colonel Matthews dismissed the crowd, and Rizab began her post-flight duties, debriefing with intelligence officers, filing after-action reports, coordinating with maintenance about the aircraft's status. The mundane paperwork that followed every combat sortie, the administrative burden that was as much a part of war as the flying itself. Hours passed before she finally made it back to her quarters, a small room in a prefabricated building that housed the transient pilot population. She stripped off her flight suit, stared at herself in the small mirror above the sink. Her face was marked with the imprint of her oxygen mask, her hair was plastered to her skull with sweat, and her eyes carried that particular exhaustion that comes from hours of sustained concentration. She looked like a warrior, she felt like one too. But underneath the fatigue, underneath the satisfaction of a successful mission, there was something else. A question that had been nagging at her since the moment she'd walked onto base that morning. How many more times would she have to prove herself? How many more missions would it take before she was simply accepted rather than constantly evaluated? She'd been flying combat for nearly a decade, had more combat hours than most squadron commanders, had a record that would have made any pilot proud. And yet she still got stopped at the gate, still got questioned, still had to earn respect that should have been given freely based on her rank and her record. The thought made her tired in a way that had nothing to do with the mission. But then she remembered the look on Colonel Matthews's face when he'd shaken her hand, the genuine respect in his eyes, the way the crowd had applauded, not because they'd been ordered to, but because they'd understood what she'd accomplished. Maybe it was getting better, slowly, incrementally, but better. Rizal lay down on her bunk and closed her eyes. Sleep came quickly, pulled her down into darkness where dreams mixed with memories, where the sound of jet engines faded into the sound of her father's voice telling her stories about the country he'd left behind, about the freedom he'd found, about the daughter who'd become more than he'd ever imagined possible. When she woke 6 hours later, night had fallen over Bagram. The base was quieter now, the daytime bustle replaced by the subdued activity of the night shift. Razat checked her phone and found a dozen messages waiting. One was from her squadron commander, a brief note congratulating her on the mission. Another was from a former classmate from flight school, someone who'd heard through the grapevine and wanted to express admiration. A third was from her father, a simple text that read, "Your mother and I are proud of you, always." That last message made her eyes sting slightly. Her father never asked about her missions, never pressed for details about what she did or where she went. He understood operational security, understood that some things couldn't be shared, but he always knew when she'd done something significant, always seemed to sense when she needed to hear those words. Rizak composed a brief reply, "Love you both, talk soon." She dressed in civilian clothes and headed to the Chow Hall, navigating the familiar paths between buildings, dodging the occasional vehicle that rumbled past in the darkness. The Chow Hall was half empty at this hour, occupied mostly by night shift personnel and the perpetually hungry. She filled her tray with whatever looked edible and found a table in the corner. She ate mechanically, fueling her body without tasting the food, her mind already moving ahead to the next day, the next mission, the next challenge. A shadow fell across her table. Rizal looked up to find Tors, her crew chief, standing there with his own tray. "Mind if I join you, ma'am?" "Please," Rizal said, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. Tors sat down, and for a moment they ate in companionable silence. Then he spoke, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to nearby tables. "I've been working on fighters for 15 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of pilots come and go. Some are good, some are great, and some are once in a generation." Rizal looked up from her food, meeting his eyes. "You're the third kind, ma'am," Tors continued. "What you did today, I've never seen anything like it. The crew is talking about it, passing around the mission footage from your cockpit camera. The way you threaded that valley, the way you took out that SAM site. It's going to be in training videos for the next 20 years. Rizal felt that familiar discomfort rising again, but she pushed it down. Tors wasn't flattering her. He was stating what he believed to be fact, and she owed him the courtesy of accepting it gracefully. "I had good equipment and good intel," she said, "and a crew chief who made sure my aircraft was perfect." Tors smiled. "That's exactly what I mean, ma'am. You could take credit, you earned it, but you don't. You spread it around, make sure everyone knows this is a team effort. That's why people would follow you anywhere." He stood up, gathering his tray. "Anyway, I just wanted to say that, and to let you know that if you ever need anything, you just say the word. The crew has your back always." He walked away before Rizal could respond, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her half-eaten meal. She sat there for a long time, watching the other diners come and go, thinking about the strange path that had led her from her father's stories to this moment, this place, this life. The next morning brought a new day and new missions. Rizal was back in the briefing room at 0600, sitting among a dozen other pilots as the intelligence officer ran through the latest updates on enemy activity, friendly positions, and restricted airspace. The routine was comforting in its familiarity. But as the briefing progressed, Rizal noticed something different. The way the other pilots looked at her had changed. There was no more skepticism, no more subtle doubt. There was respect, genuine and unqualified. One pilot, a major named Richardson, who'd always been professionally distant, caught her eye and nodded. Just a simple nod, but it carried weight. It said, "I see you. I recognize what you are."